mercenary with a smile suggested that they go to the village and discuss this when they go inside. The streets of the village were crowded with many locals wearing similar white and brown clothes. The men sat at wooden tables under a red and white roof and rested their faces on their palms. As the iron lattice gate opened, letting in the bright rays of the sun, the voice of a man was heard, who was not sure that he was seeing Theodore. A bald man with thick black eyebrows and a gray beard frowned in shock, and a fair-haired girl in a white hat and dress standing next to him said that the main character had no need to return now, because he was studying. When Albert, with tears in his eyes, loudly shouted the name of the main character and ran with him with outstretched arms, Sylvia looked at the stranger with a puzzled look, and Theodore smiled joyfully. Albert hugged the main character and began to talk about how Theodore had grown so much in all the years that they had not seen each other. Theodora and Sylvia, who were holding hands, were surrounded by local residents and expressed their happiness at the return of the protagonist to the village. Sylvia blushed sharply and pulled her hand out of Theodore's hand when a woman with a malicious smile asked about the girl's identity. The main character felt awkward and looked at Sylvia, whose cheeks were still pink. A girl with amber eyes and short hair with a wide smile suggested that Sylvia was Theodore's girlfriend, to which the girl with long hair answered her in the same manner that the main character had no need to bring such a beauty here. Embarrassed, Sylvia hid behind the protagonist while he waved away a local woman who intrusively offered Theodore to buy silk in their lingerie store. When someone loudly called Theodore, the main character turned sharply towards this voice while Sylvia continued to hide behind the young man. Among the crowd, the main character saw a dark-haired man in baggy clothes, and he loudly called Theodore. The main character broke into a gentle and warm smile when he saw his father. The surrounding people clapped their hands in joy as Theodore hugged his father tightly as he expressed his relief that his son had returned safely. Tears pooled in the corners of the man's eyes as Theodore pressed his forehead against his shoulder. The man pushed the main character away from him and with a happy smile said that he could not believe that he was meeting his son like this, immensely rejoicing that Theodore was doing well. The main character looked at his father with warmth in his eyes and said that the most important thing is that the man himself is alive and well. The man gently squeezed his hand on the protagonist's shoulder. The man asked Theodore to tell him everything when they returned home. A fire was burning with a pleasant crackling sound in a stone fireplace near a wooden bookcase. The main character, stirring the soup with a spoon, caught himself thinking that he really missed this dish. Sitting at the table with Sylvia and his father, Theodore thought that he had many stories that he would like to tell his family, but at the moment there was something more important. Raising a spoon of soup to his lips, the main character concluded that first it was necessary to fix the problem. When Theodore asked if the undead had appeared about a month ago, his father replied that they had, and that the woodcutter was the first to notice. Then the main character asked about mercenaries, because he did not remember that his family had enough money to hire such. A woman with amber eyes and brown hair looked thoughtfully at the man as he touched his face with his fingers and stated that he owed a lot to these mercenaries. Theodore's father said that the mercenaries came to fight the local bandits, and one day while they were staying in this village, these monsters attacked. When the main character asked whether the mercenaries had been protecting the village for a whole week, the man confirmed this and added that he was calm without them, but gratitude could not be too much. The main character, however, had a hard time believing these words, because mercenaries can do anything for money. The main character closed his eyes, plunging into thought. Theodore, sitting over his empty plate, thought that it was rather strange for people like mercenaries to work for free. The protagonist remembered the green-eyed mercenary he had met earlier and thought that he was too good to be the leader of a band of mercenaries, although they deserve gratitude due to their current situation. The main character put the spoon in his mouth and frowned his black eyebrows, coming to the conclusion that the actions of the wandering wolves would arouse suspicion in anyone. The main character, standing near the maid with a suitcase in his hands, turned around and saw Sylvia leisurely descending the stairs with a soft smile. Theodore left the maid with Sylvia and said goodbye to his friend. The main character slammed the wooden door behind him and exhaled with relief. Theodore looked at his palm and asked Gluttony if he could wake up now. Gluttony appeared in the protagonist's palm, sighing heavily. Gluttony said with a smile that Theodore is much more sensitive than he seems. The main character did not want to answer this and asked with a smile how many books Gluttony needed for today. The creature looked to the side and stuck out its purple tongue, answering that it would need 2 or 3 books. Theodore the next second took out a red and a yellow book, saying that in this case he would feed Gluttony too. While the creature was devouring books, the main character thought that it was better to ask one question after another in order to get more information out of Gluttony. Gluttony devoured 2 books, wrapping his long tongue around them. When the creature finished eating, the system reported the acquisition of the 4th circle magic, which was called Explosion. Gluttony became several times larger after the meal, and looked at the main character with bulging round eyes. Theodore sighed in relief, satisfied that the creature had finished eating. The main character raised his hand to his mouth and loudly announced that he would ask the creature one question. Theodore concluded that Gluttony did not know what was happening while he slept, so the protagonist had to briefly outline the situation because the creature could not understand it on his own. Theodore spoke about the missing investigator. The main character then mentioned that there were a lot of undead around. And finally, Theodore spoke about a sorcerer who controls all the undead. The main character, sitting on the bed, listened as Gluttony concluded that this was definitely not normal. Theodore became interested when the creature said that there was something that could be causing this. Gluttony lay on Theodore's palm and with his purple tongue hanging out, he announced that there seemed to be a grimoire in the cave. The main character looked at Gluttony in shock while a drop of sweat ran down the young man's face, and couldn't believe his own ears. Theodore's dark eyes widened in surprise, dismayed that grimoires like Gluttony still existed. When the protagonist, raising one eyebrow in confusion, asked about the existence of other grimoires like Gluttony, the creature explained that the grimoire in question was not from the Seven Sins series, like him. Gluttony looked straight at Theodore and smiled broadly, saying that he couldn't say for sure about the others, and that it was better for them to check for themselves rather than guess. The main character began to sweat and raised his eyebrows questioningly when Gluttony said that if Theodore wanted, the spirit would absorb his power to detect any grimoire nearby, and at the same time look for a place where the sorcerer might be hiding. While the magical grimoire smiled innocently, the protagonist, filled with disbelief due to Gluttony's unexpected generosity, immediately asked what he wanted in return for it. Gluttony stuck out his tongue and laughed, saying that this would be beneficial for both of them, and besides, the creature is capable of absorbing grimoires. Gluttony explained that he could take over the knowledge or functions of the grimoires, but more importantly, it would advance the removal of the seal. Theodore listened silently to the magical grimoire while he said that in this case, the protagonist's achievements in magic would increase several times. When Theodore, stunned by the words of the grimoire, said that he was just hungry, as always, Gluttony calmly confirmed that such was his nature. Gluttony smiled happily and said that the protagonist made a good choice when Theodore agreed to the offer of the grimoire. Gluttony began scanning, and bright blue beams shot out from his body and a loud sound filled the room. The magical grimoire scanned a deserted area with sparse trees. Gluttony then scanned the mountains, which were covered in a layer of white snow. After that, the magical grimoire scanned the cave, in the middle of which stood a man in a blue cloak that hid his entire body. Under the stranger's hood, instead of a human face, there was a skull with glowing eye sockets. Gluttony, with a satisfied broad smile, informed Theodore that he had discovered his target. When the magical grimoire reported that the skeleton, although only at the second stage, was able to partially block the detection of Gluttony, Theodore was saddened to admit that he was quite strong. When Gluttony said that the grimoire he discovered seemed to eat its owner, the protagonist arched his eyebrows in shock and began to sweat. Gluttony explained that few grimoires live in a symbiotic relationship like he does. Gluttony added with a smile that most grimoires are parasites on the bodies of those who are suitable as hosts, and they really enjoy manipulating the mind and body of the owner. Gluttony stuck out the tip of his purple tongue and summed up that the grimoire that attacked the protagonist fits this category, and, in any case, Gluttony learned of its location. The magical grimoire said that the main character was sent to explore the cave, which is in fact the lair of the grimoire and its owner, and with these words the creature prepared to go to bed. When Theodore, with a face devoid of any emotion, asked Gluttony to wait another minute, the magical grimoire prepared to listen to him. The main character asked if a magical grimoire could absorb evil spirits, since they are made of magic. Gluttony replied that Theodore was talking complete nonsense. Gluttony explained that evil spirits only move with the help of magic, and if the protagonist's idea was possible, then the magical grimoire would absorb stones that levitate with the help of magic. The main character looked upset at Gluttony when he said that evil spirits have neither magic nor wisdom, and they become just corpses when the magic runs out. Theodore frowned tensely and became interested when the magical grimoire said that there were still exceptions. Gluttony curled his mouth and stared at the protagonist with round eyes, saying that he could not answer until Theodore asked it as a question. Then the magical grimoire said goodbye to the main character and closed his eyes, breaking into a relaxed smile. Some sounds reached Theodore's ears. The main character turned his gaze to the source of the noise. Someone loudly knocked on the wooden door leading to Theodore's room, and the main character allowed entry. Randolph, wearing a brown turtleneck, smiled and apologized for the intrusion and for taking up the main character's rest time. As the man entered the room, Theodore calmly said that he knew about Randolph's visit, so he shouldn't worry about it. Randolph stared at the main character and raised one eyebrow questioningly. The mercenary sat down on a soft chair and asked with a smile if this was making it harder for Theodore to endure all this, and then said that the main character was just something, as expected. The main character, standing opposite Randolph with his arms crossed, wanted to ask the mercenary something. Theodore asked in disbelief why the mercenaries were still in the village, because it would cost them nothing to break through this crowd of undead. Randolph put his hands under the back of his head and asked if the main character suspected the mercenaries of something, and also said that they stayed here voluntarily. The mercenary closed his eyes and pressed his hand to his red hair, indignant that Theodore would not be convinced by these words. When Randolph crossed his arms and said that he could not tell Theodore absolutely everything, the protagonist sat on the edge of the desk and said that he would still like to hear it. Randolph said that a long time ago, his distant ancestor pursued a certain sorcerer into unfamiliar lands. The mercenary added that he took family heirlooms and 2 swords with him and did not return them. Randolph said their family has since become interested in finding these relics and eventually created an artifact that could trace these swords. The main character listened attentively to the speech of Randolph, who relaxed on a chair with his palms folded on top of each other. Theodore frowned when the mercenary said that the direction his ancestor pointed out was uphill. This was the same mountain that Gluttony had scanned earlier and where he had found another grimoire. Randolph, without taking his eyes off his interlocutor, said dryly that he had already given up when more than 100 years had passed. Then the man showed an artifact that had previously been silent, but now suddenly pointed in the direction of this horde of undead, and Theodore clarified whether the mercenaries were staying here for the sake of swords. Randolph coldly replied that these were not just swords, because they contained the technique of his ancestor. Confidence appeared on the man's face when he said that in 10 or 20 years he would become a sword master if he mastered this technique correctly. Theodore remained silent, but concluded to himself that Randolph was not a threat to the village if his story was true. Then Randolph put his hands under his chin again, leaned back in his chair, and said with a smile that at this stage he had reached a dead end and did not think that he would be able to get the swords if there were even more undead there, because at this rate all his subordinates would die. While Randolph talked about being prepared to evacuate with the residents, Theodore arched his eyebrows skeptically, amazed at the mercenary's politeness. Randolph folded his hands with a grin when Theodore said he would refuse the offer because half the locals would die. Randolph raised his hand and answered with a smile that half of the locals would survive. The main character closed his eyes dejectedly and said that the result is the same, no matter how you express it. Suddenly Randolph frowned and looked at Theodore with hostility. When the main character announced that he had an offer, the mercenary was slightly surprised by this. Randolph fell silent when Theodore clarified that this was not an offer, but an order. The main character, taking out a diamond-shaped object from his cloak, officially stated that he would like to hire the Wandering Wolves. Randolph couldn't believe his ears and froze, overwhelmed with shock. Theodore dumped a bag of coins on the table and said that he would pay 100 gold pieces as a deposit, and upon completion of the work the mercenaries would receive another 200. When the protagonist summed up that he would hire the Wandering Wolves for 2 days for 300 gold, Randolph rose from his chair and looked stunned at the money on the table. When the mercenary sat down on the edge of the table and asked for details, Theodore was surprised and asked if the money he was offered was not enough. Randolph replied that he, on the contrary, had a lot of money left, but it did not matter how good the payment if they were going to be sent to certain death, and then the man asked if Theodore would offer 300 gold pieces without a plan. The main character pursed his lips, thinking that Randolph was too smart to be a mercenary. Theodore said that holding the defense is pointless, and defending against the undead with their inexhaustible strength and endurance is tantamount to suicide. The mercenary squinted his green eyes at the main character and agreed that the undead were too annoying. Randolph, placing his palms on his knees, frowned when the protagonist said that he and the mercenary had only one way that could resolve the situation. The main character stated that this path is a counterattack. Randolph wondered if Theodore wanted to attack the enemy base with a small force. The mercenary touched his chin with his palm and smiled, saying that it made sense. However, Randolph immediately stopped smiling and sternly declared that this was not enough to convince him. The main character frowned in disappointment upon hearing these words. After everything Theodore offered for the mission, the mercenary crossed his arms over his chest, looked at the young master with a dissatisfied expression and declared that this was not enough to convince him. The main character frowned and said that he had already figured out the location of the sorcerer, and if a detachment of mercenaries could go ahead and protect, getting rid of him at night would not be so difficult. The blonde grinned when he heard about this, after which he asked with bewilderment why he should attack at night, offering to kill the undead during the day when they are weaker. Theodore, with a dissatisfied look, explained that this only works when attacking in open areas, but at night, when everyone is not living in the village, their base becomes extremely vulnerable. The mercenary cautiously glanced sideways at the terrifying 19-year-old child with his green eyes, asking in his thoughts what they were teaching in these magical towers. Turning away from his interlocutor, Theodore calmly voiced his plan, saying that while the Wandering Wolves would defend the village, he, Sylvia, and Mr. Randolph would attack their base. While the mercenary continued to listen, leaning on the corner of the partition, the guy assured him that in the event of an unsuccessful counterattack, the troops would be evacuated along with the residents, and he would pay 300 gold pieces if the man now agreed to cooperate with him. Randolph scratched his chin thoughtfully, concluding with a grin that the kid had caught him, and now he had no reason to refuse this offer. The blonde, as the leader of the Wandering Wolves, accepted Theodore Miller's order with a serious look. Randolph said with a frown that in the face of Marcus, the god of war, he would keep his oath to the very end, taking out an artifact with a formidable face carved to sign a contract. After these words, an energy flow began to emanate from the magical red artifact in the mercenary's hands, which went straight into the hand of the perplexed Theodore, standing opposite. The guy looked anxiously at his palm, on the back of which there was now a red mark, from which a small trail emanated. Taking his hand in his palm, the main character turned to Randolph, who continued to stand with the artifact extended forward, asking him to think about one thing. The blonde mercenary glanced at the young man in complete bewilderment and answered in the affirmative when he asked whether the trophies went to the person who hired him. After that, Theodore broke into a malicious smile, saying that there might be a family heirloom at the sorcerer's base, and wondering out loud how much it might cost in order to arouse the interest of his interlocutor. Randolph began to break out in a cold sweat, suspecting that the guy had planned from the very beginning to use the relic as a negotiating tool. Theodore noted with a sly smile that the mercenary had just acquired 300 gold pieces, and asked if he wanted to be the first to make a bet. The big sun was already disappearing behind the horizon, and dusk was gradually falling on the village. Theodore, meanwhile, was thinking about how he would get his 200 gold pieces back, and the mercenary would take the relics while he was indignant about the terms of the contract behind his back. Randolph reported that his warriors were already in place, adding that even if twice as many undead as yesterday came, they would be easily repulsed. The sun had already disappeared behind the forest, and the mercenary admitted that he was impressed by the young master. He closed his eyes and noted with a slight smile that in addition to the fact that his young employer is an extraordinary magician, he also has excellent organizational skills because he was able to prepare everything in half a day. Dusk had already fallen on the ground, and Theodore, with the shadow of his hair on his face, turned to the side, casting a glance at Sylvia as she pulled herself up. "I'm holding a mug with a hot drink in my hands," the guy asked if the girl had really just gotten up. Sylvia, also holding a mug of hot drink, confirmed the guess and noted with satisfaction that she had not slept well for a long time. Theodore concluded that the sun was setting and informed two companions nearby that it was time to prepare. "Grab a hot drink from your mug," the main character stated that it was going to be a long night. Meanwhile, darkness was thickening over the village, only slightly dispersed by the light of the moon. At this time, detachments of bloodthirsty undead began to move towards the settlement, raising dust behind them. A bald mercenary from a squad of wandering wolves said that just looking at the dead, he was already tired, and then his colleague in a robe with a hood sarcastically replied that there would be a whining here when they were done with everything. The leader of the detachment, standing in front of everyone, enthusiastically raised his right hand, clenched into a fist, upward. Randolph, with a bloodthirsty smile, declared that all his subordinates had worked hard, and now they could enjoy the bloody night until dawn. All the mercenaries followed the man's example and also raised their hands, with and without weapons, clenched into fists, and the leader said that today everything would end and asked those gathered to prepare for farewell to the evil spirits. The squad of wandering wolves, full of determination, now directed their forces to fight the advancing undead. Now the trio stood on the paved road, listening to the strange sounds and preparing for their part of the plan. Theodore, concentrating on his magic, activated the weight reduction skill. Sylvia, who raised her wooden staff with enthusiasm, used the skill of concealing magic. Randolph, meanwhile, squatted down, concluding that everything had finally begun, and asked if the magicians were ready. Theodore confirmed his readiness, adding that they were counting on the man, and together with Sylvia they looked at the sitting mercenary. Randolph looked very focused, his brow furrowed. The next moment he lifted the guys onto his shoulders, raising columns of dust around them. While Randolph looked forward with a glassy gaze, blue electrical discharges formed around him. He took off abruptly, flying high into the sky and leaving a trail of lightning and dust behind him. The man rose to the sky, then sank to the ground, jumping up again, as evidenced by the bright trail trailing behind him. Randolph carried Theodore and Sylvia away in what looked like one long bolt of lightning due to the speed. The boy and girl were hanging from the mercenaries' shoulders, tears flowing from their eyes due to the high speed, but they admired the way the aura users moved. Randolph, without stopping, rushed over the red heads of the undead. The next moment, lightning was already stretching from him through the forest, and he pushed off from the branch while the guy's legs flew up in the air. Taking on the most concentrated look, Randolph said that from now on he was following Theodore's commands, asking him to lead him along the shortest route. The guy, in a not very comfortable position, shaking on his shoulder while running, pointed from behind to the mercenary to go 40 degrees to the left until he saw a small rock. After that, the man left the tree branch and quickly rushed further, leaving a lightning trail behind him. Randolph held the boys tightly by the back as they began to descend sharply. When the mercenary stood firmly on his feet, he reported that they were there, specifying where to go next. "And you," such a shaking Theodore, began to feel sick. He asked to let them go, to which the mercenary said guiltily that he had completely forgotten that he was carrying the guys on his shoulders. Now the main character stood in front with a serious look, leaving his partners behind him, and asked before they entered to be allowed to scan the place. Concentratingly squeezing his hand in front of his face, the guy activated mana scanning and began to inspect the space. Theodore stood in complete darkness, and a small gap opened in front, against which his dark figure could be seen. The guy frowned, casting a questioning glance forward. Above the main character stood a skeleton with a blue skull, dressed in a robe. Theodore rolled his eyes as a bony hand pointed its index finger directly at the bridge of his nose. After such a vision, the guy covered his eyes with his hands, gritting his teeth from what he saw, and Sylvia, concerned, asked if he was okay. Theodore stated that everything was fine, while the girl looked at him with concern, and he thought about the feeling that he had been overwhelmed by dark mana, which could become a great threat to the mission. Covering his face with his hand, the main character said with contempt that the sorcerer was definitely there, and added that the whole cave was filled with this dark mana. He snapped his fingers, and a fire formed above them, after which he could enter. Theodore led the way, illuminating the cave walls with his magic, while Sylvia and Randolph trudged cautiously behind him. The main character froze for a moment, bringing his hand with fire close to his face. Looking ahead with concern, he raised his hand clenched into a fist, and his partners stopped. Randolph glanced up, horrified. Above Theodore, holding the fire, towered the silhouette of a bloodthirsty undead. A skeleton in a robe, raising his bony finger, met the intruders in rage, threatening that they would pay with their lives for the invasion of his base. The enraged sorcerer sharply ordered the crowd of undead to kill and eat the trio who dared to sneak into this place. Holding his fingers with fire in front of him, Theodore gloomily concluded that they had arrived on time. Randolph, with clinics in both hands, confirmed this with a grin, offering to deal maximum damage to the Magu until he begins to beg for mercy. The main character, meanwhile, with a malicious grin, extended his hand forward with a stream of fiery energy, announcing the start of the operation. While flames were emanating from the hand and Theodore, he carefully scanned the enemy, seeing a barrier in one hand. Enraged corpses of enormous size came running into the light of the fire, wanting to deal with the guy. Video of approaching monsters, the main character extended his arms forward and suddenly activated a fireball to attack them. Randolph stood in place with sabers in his hands, carefully watching how the undead burned in a bright flame. The next moment, the mercenary rushed into battle, waving his weapon. Seeing Theodore's magic in the cave, Randolph initially thought that he was hurting himself, but now he separated the trio from the undead with a barrier right after another fire technique. Against the background of the flames, the dark silhouette of the main character could be seen, and the blonde in front concluded that he only had to finish off those dead that were still burning out. Randolph now stood with his hand on his waist while Theodore asked Sylvia to help air things out, suggesting the boys take a break while there was still air. When the guy asked how much mana the girl had left, she, holding the staff in her hands, enthusiastically announced that it was about 80%. After this, Theodore turned to Mr. Randolph, and he assured that everything was fine, he could still continue to fight. The brunette looked back at the guys with a satisfied smile and created a new fire between his fingers, offering to go forward. The trio, led by Theodore, who illuminated the path with his fire magic, moved further through the dark cave filled with the sorcerer's mana. Looking at the fire from his fingers, the main character recalled that, according to reports, the cave goes 40 meters deep, which means that the guys should have gone through it a long time ago. Suddenly, one not very joyful thought struck Theodore, which is why he became noticeably gloomy, continuing to watch the fire. After that, the guy turned around and turned to Mr. Randolph, having a plan of action, and the man chuckled questioningly. Theodore asked him to scratch the wall with his sword, and if possible, use aura, and the mercenary decided to try. The next moment, Randolph swung his blade in an attempt to scratch the cave wall, slightly shaking the space around him. There was a deep dark mark left on the stone wall, inflicted by a sharp saber. Almost immediately after cutting part of the wall, the cut suddenly disappeared, leaving not a single trace. Randolph looked dumbfounded at the absolutely intact stone wall, noticing that his cut in the rock had disappeared before his eyes, and Theodore behind him, after confirming his guess, said with a gloomy look that it was expected. The guy with a puzzled look, twisting his mouth from overwhelming panic, told his partners that they were in a dungeon. He cast his eyes warily around the surrounding area, concluding that the trio were not in the best situation. Suddenly, Theodore's attention was caught by a light blue glow, on which he fixed his puzzled gaze. The guy was very perplexed when a picture with creatures resembling ghosts opened in front of him on the cave wall, and he assumed that these were spectrals. Randolph, standing in a fighting pose with sabers in hand, concluded with displeasure that he had not taken holy water for such an occasion. Theodore turned his gaze to him and, realizing that the man had decided to engage in battle, was worried for his safety. It was all true, as Randolph leaned forward even more, furiously announcing that nothing could be done, so he was going to go first. Theodore, with his arm outstretched, turned sharply to the mercenary, asking him to stand behind him, which confused the man. Gritting his teeth from tension, the guy demanded to be faster and began releasing magic with the blue glow from his palm. Randolph cursed, realizing what was happening, and decided to trust the young master, quickly running away behind him. While Theodore struggled to hold back the glowing cluster of entities on the wall ahead, they made frightening sounds. In the palm of the main character, Gluttony's mouth opened, which began to absorb magical ghosts, and the guy concluded that nowhere in this world is there a predator that is afraid of its prey. The frightening entities began to slowly disappear from the wall like steam. Theodore held his hand in front of him and, full of determination, asked Gluttony to absorb everything, and the space around began to shake from the large amount of energy absorbed. Phantom entities flowed in a huge stream towards the palm of the protagonist, falling directly into the open mouth of the grimoire. Gluttony continued and continued to consume the cluster of ghosts until the very end. After this, the turquoise tablet appeared and said that the ghost of the goblin shaman had been absorbed. Concentrated, Theodore sharply clenched his hand into a fist while there was still a haze around it. The signs continued to report all the absorbed ghosts, and later one of them gave information that the user had not yet unlocked this ability. At this moment, the main character realized the words of gluttony that he could not absorb the dead, but there were exceptions, one of which was spectrals, being ghosts or astral bodies. Randolph looked at Theodore in bewilderment, asking what it was when the guy raised his left hand, and the spectrals were sucked into it, and Sylvia, meanwhile, was simply in shock. The next moment, the girl exclaimed in admiration, explaining the technique and asking Theodore to teach her as well, which greatly embarrassed the guy, who thought that both partners were standing behind and, fortunately, did not see his secret. The main character closed his eyes, with a sly smile, wondering whether the guys would believe him if he showed him a pre-prepared pendant, which is an artifact. Suddenly, Theodore felt a strange shaking, and everything around became filled with a red glow, which caused the guy great anxiety and confusion. A scarlet haze began to descend over the shocked and frightened trio, and they screamed and asked what was happening this time. All the guys raised their heads up. I noticed red cracks in the ceiling, and Theodore concluded with horror that the space was expanding. Now a sculpture in a red haze hung from the ceiling, from which a magical glow emanated. Gritting his teeth, the main character cautiously concluded that this sculpture had been the source of menacing and dark mana all this time. Now blue energy began to emanate upward from the emerging figure as a powerful beam, spreading through the space as a light haze. A creature began to burst out of the white matter, as if from a canvas, calling the uninvited guests damned rats who destroyed his creatures. The white canvas slowly tore on the face of the emerging creature, which continued to threaten the trio with death, and declared that they were only insects that could not kill it. Having completely freed himself from matter, the sorcerer said that if they had come a day or even half a day earlier, they could have interrupted the completion of this body. After this, the embittered owner of the dungeon said that now only death awaits the trio, and he will try to imprint it in their memory. The sorcerer screamed furiously, tearing the remnants of the white matter on himself, demanding to tremble before the greatness of one freed from the shackles of mortal life. When the creature tore the white cloth on itself and stood proudly in front of the guys, Theodore was horrified to recognize it as the Elder Lick. Gritting his teeth, Randolph cast a worried glance at the enemy and wondered how the Elder Lick got here, asking whether the young master had a plan for this case. An alarmed Theodore explained that, unlike an ordinary lick, which disappears when the body is destroyed, the Elder Lick will not die as long as the soul lives. In other words, the guys needed to find his vessel of life, because if you don't destroy it, this bastard will come back to life again and again. While the guys looked at the formidable creature in front, Randolph said with dissatisfaction that their enemy with an immortal body would be difficult to kill once. Theodore, standing in front of everyone, stated with concentration that he would look for a vessel of life, asking the guys to distract the lick. The sorcerer turned to the trio, declaring that he wanted to kill them and turn their bodies into his servants, but with a malicious smile he said that he had changed his mind about doing this. He put his folded hands forward so that the uninvited guests would clearly hit the space between his index and thumbs. The creature turned to the taken aback Theodore, declaring that he would leave him alive because it would be interesting to experiment on him. Then Randolph remarked with a malicious laugh that the sorcerer only spoke well, and Sylvia angrily asked who he was to take Theo alive. The sorcerer, meanwhile, put his fists at chest level to each other, concluding that with such an unfamiliar body it would be difficult to adapt to the guy's weakness. The creature looked at Theodore with curiosity, calling his power unique, wondering why the guy only had the fourth magic circle. The main character looked worried from such a close look from the monster, who concluded that he would deal with him later. Licky folded his hands into a seal, deciding to deal with the guy later and making him disappear. Theodore's body began to shake, and he looked at his hand in bewilderment and shock, not understanding what was happening. Against the background of the mercenary with knees, the space of the dungeon began to expand, and bright red cracks began to spread along the walls. Outraged by the impudence of her enemy, Sylvia began to scream heart-rendingly, calling out to Theo with excitement. Randolph also shouted with all his might, calling for the young master. The evil sorcerer continued to hold his hands in the seal, concentrating on making the guys disappear and making strange sounds. Randolph's eyes were wide open in shock, and the blonde strands of his hair obscured them slightly. Looking as crazy as possible, he began to strike the enemy with furious blows, without taking his eyes off him. He looked at the sorcerer with hatred, concluding with bewilderment that he had hit him right in the head, but his blow did not cause any damage, and now he was fighting off a retaliatory attack. The man asked why the creature towering above him with an eerie look in the blue haze was still moving. The mercenary and Sylvia warily looked at the red cracks of the expanding space of the dungeon above their heads, worriedly calling out to the disappeared Theodore. Out of rage, the girl clenched her teeth, asking the enemy where you sent him, but Mac replied that this should not worry her, at least not now. Holding his hands together in a seal, the Lick menacingly declared that by setting foot on this shrine, the guys had chosen their death, and now he was going to turn them into undead, serving him and mourning their fate. A kind of halo of pieces appeared above the sorcerer's head as he concentratedly awakened his servants, who were locked in a deep abyss from their deep sleep. He stretched his arms forward, demanding the undead to appear in front, and the space was again filled with a red glow. Sharp claws were visible on the man's hands extended toward the expanding space. The lick pulled his palms higher and higher towards himself, lifting the ground and freeing his servants. From a space filled with red light, a dead man emerged with 2 sabers, who was now squatting, leaning on a muscular black arm. The face of the awakened servant was covered with a cloth. Looking at all this, Randolph, to whom the dead man who emerged from the ground looked very much like, said with a sarcastic grin that the sorcerer was mocking him. Now standing ready in front of the elder Lick was a muscled, dead man in white pants with sabers in both hands and a covered face, and the sorcerer declared that the mercenary's swordsmanship was very similar to his servant's. After these words, Randolph bared his teeth angrily, fiercely straining through his teeth so that the enemy would close his mouth. Not wanting to hear anything more from the sorcerer, the mercenary furiously declared that he was going to tear him to shreds. Lee looked at the enraged man with malice, declaring that he had a special relationship with his servant, and questioning whether the enemy would be able to kill the swordmaster. Randolph angrily muttered through his teeth that he didn't even care about the sword god. Taking a fighting position with sabers, the mercenary furiously declared that he would cut down his opponent. While the beefy servant with a hidden face was also preparing his weapon, the sorcerer mockingly noted the self-confidence of the blonde man. Randolph closed his eyes slightly and frowned, casting a cold-blooded glance at his opponent, while strands of hair covered his face. The man strained his hand very hard, and the veins stood out on it. The elder Lick, watching the angry man, coldly asked whether such are the instincts of people that they challenge the invincible to battle. Afterwards, the sorcerer lowered his black eyes and decided that this was not something worth worrying about now, reflecting on the emotion rushing out from his master. The creature with the halo turned to Sylvia, suggesting that this feeling of inferiority came from her. The girl pulled forward a wooden staff, looking at the sorcerer with confusion while he called her the best student of Blundell, the current ruler of the Blue Tower, and then the creature asked her master if he really had such unpleasant feelings for this little lady. Sylvia was completely bewildered, not understanding what we were talking about. Then the sorcerer asked with mockery whether the trio had come for the magician Giovanni from the Blue Tower, with whom they had lost contact. After these words, Sylvia gritted her teeth and gripped her staff tightly in rage, questioning what her enemy had just said. Lowering his darting gaze, the sorcerer concluded with a chuckle that the owner was already impatient to punish the girl for forgetting him. Sylvia was completely perplexed, not understanding what was happening at all. However, the girl, raising a wooden staff, said with determination that no matter what, she would defeat the enemy and return her Theo. The sorcerer, breaking into a wide smile, sarcastically declared that the girl had more courage than his master, accepting the little lady's challenge and asking her to entertain him. At this time, a battle was in full swing between Randolph and the sorcerer's servant, who had a blade in each hand and were now flying furiously at each other at high speed. When the men got very close to each other, the mercenary, gritting his teeth, looked angrily at the enemy's face covered with white cloth. As the 2 pairs of steel blades clashed fiercely during the battle, bright sparks flew from them. The dead man made a sharp attack with one of the red swords on the mercenary, covering himself with the second from the blow of the blonde, but he was able to quickly dodge it. Both opponents made furious attempts to damage each other with fast and sharp movements. Lowering his head, Randolph, sabers in his hands, turned his back to the dead man, who pointed his sword at him. The mercenary, surrounded by a light haze, turned around slightly, closely watching the actions of his opponent behind him. The dead man put both his blades forward, deciding to strike. He rushed from his spot, quickly flying towards the stopped blonde. When the sorcerer's servant was right next to Randolph, he jumped into the air, raising his blades to strike back. The flying man was behind the dead man, crossing his sabers on his shoulders. The next moment, the mercenary put both blades forward to pierce the enemy with them. The dead man quickly retreated back in the blue haze, leaving the blonde in the distance. Both men now faced each other, raising their swords furiously for another attack. Through the white canvas, the risen dead man intently watched the enemy. Randolph kept up with him, never taking his eyes off his enemy. The men's blades clashed again, and sparks rained down from them in a fountain in all directions. Randolph clenched his teeth in tension. The mercenary concluded with displeasure that this old man, even becoming undead, was still impenetrable. Throwing a frown at his opponent, the blonde concluded that if he weakened his defense even a little, he would become a corpse, and deciding that getting into the heart of a dead opponent was the only way to defeat him. Suddenly Randolph was greatly horrified, noticing a completely unexpected detail. When his eyes lowered to the red swords of the dead man, he could see a familiar coat of arms on one of them. The puzzled man recognized it as the familiar coat of arms of Clovis. This family was one of the strongest in the Andres Empire, valuing strength above all else. At one time it was even the most prestigious and occupied the place of the 7 swords of the Empire, but the Clovis fell after a terrible incident. Both opponents clashed swords again, flying in different directions from the strong recoil. The dead man braked abruptly as he moved away from his opponent. He froze in place, taking a fighting pose with his red swords crossed. The disappearance of the man with the royal decree that was given to the family was the beginning of their downfall, and Randolph now reflected that the purpose of the search was right in front of him right now, and most likely this corpse was his ancestor. As the mercenary crossed balls in preparation for an enemy attack, He thought that unlike humans with their limited stamina, the undead could fight as long as they were supplied with mana. When the sorcerer's servant began to attack, the blonde remembered that his opponent was also a sword master in the past, so it was dangerous to drag out the battle. The undead furiously attacked Randolph while he, gritting his teeth, tried hard to defend himself, which was difficult for him. The deadman brought one of the balls forward, aiming it straight at his opponent. However, Randolph managed to react quickly, jumping to the side. The next moment, the mercenary had already raised his swords, cutting the body of the dead man. The tense blonde exclaimed that he was able to cut off his opponent's head, leaving him unable to move for some time. Blocking the monster's attack while in his thoughts, Randolph was sure that he had cut off its head, surprised by the fact that he immediately restored it. Continuing to think, he wondered if the head was the weak point of the undead. Wary, Randolph, thinking about this madness, noted that the battle should not be delayed. Looking at the monster, whose face was shrouded in fog, he stated that he needed to quickly find and destroy the source. With unimaginable power, Randolph struck his opponent, after which, he jumped back and froze in one position. Continuing to observe the monster in his thoughts, Randolph noted that its resilience was terrifying, suggesting that, having become an undead, it retained the skills of a swordmaster. The monster's body was covered with streams of red aura. Paying attention to the smoke and aura of the enemy, Randolph believed that with such a rotten body, he performed every technique perfectly. Biting his lip, he thought that his opponent was an undead who was an echo of the past with swordsmanship from over a century ago, stating that once he could destroy the source, he would have a chance. Smirking, Randolph ordered the undead to pay attention to his pathetic appearance, calling him an old man, asking if he should call him an ancestor. Randolph noted that he searched for a long time and found it, turned into a stinking undead. Raising his blade, he announced that thanks to his opponent, all the heirs of the Clovis family were on the street. With a serious expression on his face, Randolph suggested that the undead might also be victims. Looking at the wary enemy, Randolph stated that the royal decree was simply a cover for the Andras family to destroy them. Tilting his head, he assumed that the undead regretted following the Emperor's orders. The eyes of the undead were enveloped in genuine rage. Gripping his sword, Randolph said that he would give such an old man stuck in this crappy world a chance. Putting his weapon forward, he declared that he would give him a chance for eternal peace, asking him to allow himself to be killed. Turning his attention to the undead, who froze in one position, Randolph was taken aback. Clenching his hand into a fist, his opponent lowered his finger down. With a perplexed look, Randolph was lost in his thoughts. A red aura continued to swirl around the undead face. Baring his teeth, Randolph wondered if he was serious. After his words, the undead hung in the air. Beside himself with rage, Randolph rushed to the attack. With lightning speed, he tried to strike multiple blows at the undead. Suddenly, his blade was in the enemy's face. Suddenly, the undead managed to block his attack, causing him to become horrified. Wary, Randolph decided to jump to the side, but his opponent did not stop slowing down, continuing to attack. Raising his sword in front of his face, Randolph prepared to defend himself. Sparks could be seen emanating from their blades on the battlefield. Baring his teeth, Randolph froze in one position. With a serious expression on his face, he wondered if he would die here, after which, driving away these thoughts, he declared that he would return no matter how. Lowering his hands, Randolph thought about taking the swords from his opponent. Squeezing the blade in his hand, he was sure that after this he would return home. An image of a woman who was in deep sleep surfaced in his memories. A man approached him and tried to find out if he had already chosen those who would remain. Raising his finger, he declared that His Majesty had allowed only one person to be taken. Randolph stared into space, lost in thought. Next, he put his hand on the bed where the girl was sleeping. At his touch, she began to mutter something under her breath. When she woke up, she wondered if she had asked him not to disturb her while she slept. The bailiff came up from her bed and was shocked by what she saw. Leaning over, the man said that it was an honor for him to meet her, adding that his name was Mary and that he was the butler of this family, noting that that included hers. As he set out, he declared that she was now a member of their family, saying that under his guidance she would rise to master as an imperial soldier. Trying to catch his breath, Randolph froze in one position. Genuine anger was visible on his face. He stated that he was obliged to return no matter what. Steam was emanating from Randolph's body. With unimaginable speed, he decided to attack the undead again. Due to his amazing speed, he managed to get behind his opponent, ready to strike. Just as Randolph's blade was about to catch up with him, he struck with his elbow. Due to the powerful blow, Randolph was thrown to the side, after which, pointing their blades forward, the undead rushed to attack. Putting his weapon behind his back, his opponent rushed into battle. The red aura continued to cover the undead's body. After the blow was struck, Randolph's body was thrown aside again. Hanging in the air, his blades crossed, he prepared to parry the blow of the undead. Having overtaken his opponent, he crossed swords with him. Randolph's face was filled with furious rage. Their gazes crossed within a centimeter of each other. Suddenly, Randolph's blade began to crack. At the sight of a fierce battle, the grinding of swords could be heard. Once above the undead, Randolph froze in one position. Having thrust his blades into his opponent's body, he began to fall down. A powerful roar came from his mouth. The undead were shocked by what they saw. Using his incredible strength, Randolph managed to neutralize his opponent by grabbing his arms. Smirking, Randolph suggested that since he had been waiting for the undead for 100 years, he didn't think he would complain if he won. Streams of blue smoke emanated from his opponent's hands. Watching the undead, crouching on one knee, Randolph positioned himself next to him. Purple clouds formed at the sight of the fight, after which, Randolph let go of his blades, causing them to fall to the floor. A weapon formed in his hand, completely covered in blood. A small smile appeared on Randolph's face. His opponent began to gradually evaporate. Observing all this, Randolph asked him not to worry about anything and sleep peacefully, calling him a dear ancestor. Suddenly, the entire area was covered in blood red. Horrified, he turned his attention to Sylvia, who was unconscious. Looking at Randolph, who tried to raise his comrade, the Lick noted that he still managed to defeat the Sword Master, calling the outcome rather unexpected. Raising his hand, he declared that in this case, he would make Randolph his subordinate. Wary, Randolph tried to find out what was happening to their enemy, after which, Sylvia informed him about mana. With an exhausted expression on her face, she stated that she was running out of mana. Suddenly, someone's fist appeared from the depths of the blue smoke. Standing with his back to the guys, the Lick formed a cloud of powerful aura in his hand. With a malicious grin, he announced that they needed to finally finish. Finding himself in complete darkness, the main character noted that he could not see anything, after which a flame appeared at the tip of his finger, which illuminated the room. Lifting his head up, he wondered what was going on, turning to the Elder Lick. Before his gaze was an unknown object hanging in the air. Looking around the place where he arrived, Theodore noted that there was not a single opening, adding that everything was closed. With a worried look, he said that this was the perfect secret room. Having noticed an unknown object, the main character wondered what it was. Taken aback, he said that he could not believe that he could not use all the power. Further, he assumed that in front of him was the heart of the dungeon. Putting his hand to his face, Theodore said that he had goosebumps from the mana hanging here. He was sure that this crystal was the heart. Looking at the heart of the dungeon, the main character cried out that it was a vessel of life. Wiping a drop of sweat from his face, Theodore thought that the Elder Lick used his heart as the basis of the dungeon, which is why he can use spatial transformation. Enveloping his hands in powerful flames, the protagonist believed that the Elder Lick was the evil behind all these events, noting that his heart was right in front of him. After which, concentrating, Theodore activated the flame shield. Having formed a fiery projectile, the main character thought that if he destroyed the vessel of the Elder Lick, he could get rid of him and the army of the undead at once. After which, he released a fiery sphere into the heart of the dungeon. Looking at the heart of the dungeon, Theodore hoped it would work. Further, the main character discovered that his technique had no effect on the heart of the dungeon. Baring his teeth, he wondered why this was not enough. An image of a man appeared in his head, in whose hands a blade was visible and a magician using one of his techniques. While in his thoughts, the main character said that according to historical records, only the aura of a sword master or the power of a seventh circle magician would destroy him, noting that in other words, he would not be able to harm him in any way. Slamming his fist on the floor, Theodore screamed in indignation. Lowering his head, he announced that it would be difficult for him to reach the others. Looking around, Theodore said that he did not know where he was, stating that there was a chance of collapse if he crumbled the walls left and right. After which, the main character wondered what he should do, not understanding whether he had enough strength. Leaning on his arm, he froze in one position. Raising his finger, Theodore thought what if he used all the mana he had and sacrificed his hand for a magic bullet. Folding his hands, he assumed that he could recreate the power of the magic bullet from the time of Alfred the Great. Looking at the dungeon's heart, he noted that with his level, his arms might not be able to withstand the force. Baring his teeth, the protagonist understood that he could not guarantee success. Getting into a fighting position, he realized that this was the only way out in such a situation, noting that he didn't even have a choice. Having formed a cloud of red aura, Theodore thought about one shot in which he would put all his strength. Many sparks emanated from the protagonist's technique at the moment when he was thinking about destroying the undead. Wary, Theodore froze in one position. An image of gluttony appeared in his head, which spoke of how the undead moved solely with the help of magic, noting that if magic was removed, walkers would become ordinary corpses, adding that they were not magical creatures. After taking the shot, the protagonist thought about the exception, which was that gluttony couldn't eat zombies and ghouls, but ate specters, adding that he was never interested in mitre. Looking at the heart of the dungeon, Theodore wondered if the vessel contained magic. Clenching his fist, the main character froze, waiting for a reaction. Covering his face with his hands, he thought about the vessel of life that gives immortality to the Elder Lick, noting that it fit the conditions. Continuing his thoughts, he stated that he would even say that he was perfect for them. Putting his hand to the vessel, Theodore used the assessment skill. The system that appeared in front of him reported that this seal was created with the help of dark knowledge, and also contained the soul of Giovanni, possessed by black magic. Noting that this seal was protected by a contract of dark forces, the system revealed that it nullifies all attacks below a certain level and cannot be targeted by spatial magic, adding that as long as the seal exists, Giovanni will have limited immortality. The system noted that the magic item in question was rated as a treasure, stating that when absorbed, a huge amount of magic would be absorbed. The system reported that when absorbed, the assimilation would take 3 days, and when absorbed, part of Giovanni's knowledge and skills would be absorbed. Further, the system stated that relations with the unknown would become hostile. With an excited expression on his face, the main hero thought that he knew about it, noting that it was also a treasure. Turning to the magical grimoire that was on his hand, Theodore asked him to start eating. Sticking out his tongue, the glutton declared that he had been waiting for this for a long time. After which, wrapping it around the heart of the dungeon, he prepared for the absorption process. Holding his hand, Theodore froze in one position. Turning his attention to the vessel that had been consumed by gluttony, the main character saw how the system informed him of the completion of the process. The system stated that he had absorbed some of the knowledge of the sorcerer Giovanni's skills, noting that the complete absorption would take 3 days. Further, the system noted that an unknown creature was interested in Theodore. Raising his hands, the Elder Lick released a stream of powerful aura towards the guys. Screaming, Sylvia used a shield to avoid a direct blow from the Lick. His streams of aura enveloped the barrier. Lowering her gaze, Sylvia thought that fighting him with fifth circle magic was too risky, noting that she couldn't believe that much magic in one sentence. Pulling the magic staff towards her and continuing to think, she reported that she had less than 3% of her mana left, adding that this was too little for her. Forming a blob of green aura in his hand, the Elder Lick noted that it was not bad, stating that it would make good material. Wary, Sylvia wondered what she should do, reporting that at this rate she would not last long. After which, putting his hands forward, the Elder Lick again attacked the guys. Due to the colossal power of his technique, Sylvia collapsed to the ground. Rushing towards the Elder Lick, Randolph ordered him to disappear. While protected by the barrier, the Elder Lick noted that Randolph was not bad. Concentrating, using his technique, he pushed Randolph's body to the side. Rising from the ground, Sylvia turned her attention to the cloud of green smoke that appeared on the battlefield. Screaming, Randolph asked her to shoot the moment he distracted the Elder Lick, after which, Sylvia nodded her head in approval. Raising her hand, she addressed the Lord of Cold, Ymir. At that moment, the Elder Lick watched as a powerful glow appeared in her hands. Smirking, he wondered if this was her last trump card. Getting into a fighting position, Sylvia used a quiet blizzard. A powerful glow of technology enveloped the Elder Lick in the place of the duel. Streams of the Elder Lick's aura continued to sparkle in the air. With a cry, Randolph reported a positive result. While in the shackles of the technique, the Elder Lick stated his superior skills, noting that he expected this from a Blue Tower disciple, noting that they would not save them from death. Looking at the cracks, he said that once Sylvia's mana runs out and the ice melts, they will die, adding that these are their last seconds. Smirking, the Elder Lick declared that they were now his subordinates and would serve forever in the name of the Great Death. Stretching his hands forward, he released an unimaginable amount of aura. Looking at the powerful surge of aura, Randolph wondered if this was how he would meet his end. Running up to him, Sylvia used one of her techniques, which caused strange sounds to appear at the scene of the fight. Wary, the Elder Lick tried to find out what that vile sound was. Suddenly, his body was covered with a huge piece of ice. Crying out indignation, the Elder Lick called her a pathetic worm. Sylvia's technique began to gradually tighten. Holding the blades in his hands, Randolph froze in one position. Streams of the Elder Lick's aura continued to be visible from the depths of Sylvia's technology. Suddenly, part of an object fell out of them. Surprised, Randolph tried to find out what had just happened. Suddenly, the guys noticed a mysterious glow that could be seen from above. Getting into a fighting pose, Randolph declared that the bloody space was disappearing, noting that they were back in the cave. With a worried expression on her face, Sylvia turned to the main character. Looking at the cloud of red aura, Theodore assumed it had worked, hoping that Sylvia and Randolph were okay. Clenching his fist, he wondered why things weren't the same, noting that the dungeon had been destroyed. The main character suggested that because of this, the space should take on its original appearance. Looking around, he wondered if there was another heart, reporting that he had never heard of there being more than one in the dungeons. Suddenly, a dark aura formed behind him and tried to break out. From what he saw, the main character was shocked. Seeing the book in front of him, Theodore assumed that the aura came from it, believing that it was the grimoire. The yellow glow emanated from the mysterious grimoire. Sticking out his tongue, Gluttony tried to find out if Theodore was using space distortion on him, wondering who he was holding it to. Next, he asked the main character to leave this matter to him. After which, the magical grimoire directed its tongue towards the artifact. Screaming, Gluttony noted the freshness of the artifact. The book, in the shackles of Gluttony, tried to break out. Loud screams came from the depths of the grimoire. Wary, deep in his thoughts, Theodore could not believe that the scream was coming from the grimoire. Using his tongue, Gluttony threw this book from side to side. Looking at the grimoire, he wondered if it wanted its user. Smirking, Gluttony tried to see if he thought someone like him could use his user as a host. Theodore's gaze was fixed on the grimoire, from which screams continued to be heard. Raising his palm, the unknown person said that he had changed his mind, noting that he would capture them alive. Frozen in one position, in his thoughts, the main character assumed that it was for this reason that he was teleported here alone. The mysterious grimoire continued to be in the shackles of gluttony. Looking at it, the system reported that this grimoire contained the soul of Jerem, a legendary sorcerer who is a necromancer of the Ninth Circle, noting that he fought alongside demons against humanity, capturing the body of any creature that read the grimoire and turning him into an undead. The system said that he dreams of a perfect resurrection while his soul rests in the abyss, adding that the rank of the grimoire is equal to legendary. The system noted that when absorbed, there is a very low chance of absorbing 50 to 100% of Jerem's sorcerer abilities, adding that the negative space and undead previously belonging to Jerem will belong to Theodore. The system reported that when absorbed, there is a high chance that the sorcerer Jerem will take over his body, stating that if the protagonist wants to reduce the likelihood, then he needs to unlock another gluttony seal and improve the abilities. Horrified, Theodore thought about the Ninth Circle. Sticking his hand forward, in his thoughts, he announced the knowledge that about 1,000 years had passed since the disappearance of the magicians of the Ninth Circle from the continent. With an excited expression on his face, the main character thought that if such a magician appeared again, he would be able to subjugate the whole world. With a serious expression on his face, he noted one thing. Turning his gaze to gluttony, Theodore asked if he was aware that he could not eat it now. Waving its tongue, the magical grimoire wondered who said this, wondering if the chance of a successful absorption was too high. Next, Gluttony tried to find out if it was worth the chance to become a 9th level mage. Surprised, the main character asked if he could master such a grimoire. Gluttony reported that this is both yes and no. Wary, Theodore wondered if this was a secret function. Looking at the protagonist's downcast gaze, Gluttony stated that he could say no more, noting that in about 5 minutes their opponent would regain his power and try to escape again, adding that he just wanted Theodore to know this, asking him not to worry. Indignant, the main character called the enemy a pathetic worm. Watching Gluttony in his thoughts, Theodore revealed that he had borrowed the spatial pocket from his master, stating that in such a situation he could no longer hold on to it, noting that if he allowed the grimoire to escape, then the second, and maybe the third Giovanni will appear somewhere again. Looking at Gluttony, the main character tried to find out what would happen to the contents of the spatial pocket if he ate him. Asking Theodore not to worry, Gluttony said that nothing would be lost. Taken aback, the protagonist noted that this was an ambiguous answer. Handing it to Gluttony, Theodore asked him to quickly take it before he changed his mind. After which, the magical grimoire began the process of absorption. The spatial pocket's gaze was shrouded in bewilderment. The system reported his absorption in the hidden function of Gluttony, which is now open. Sticking out his tongue, Gluttony froze in one position. Further, the system revealed that after absorbing the dimensional pocket, one of the hidden functions of the magical grimoire was revealed, noting that it now contains storage for the victims it cannot yet absorb, adding that the former owners stored things in it and called it inventory, informing that if desired, the name can be changed. Surprised, the protagonist wondered if this was a hidden function. Grinning, Theodore noted that if it had the same functionality as the spatial pocket, then it was not necessary to absorb it. Smirking, Gluttony stated that the main character cannot put the grimoire in his pocket, adding that despite this, he can hold it there for a while, saying that as soon as the grimoire comes to its senses, he will teleport out of there. After which, Theodore tried to find out if things were different with the inventory. Looking at the protagonist, whose eyes were drawn to the grimoire, Gluttony reported that this was so, noting that the inventory was a space that existed within him and was different from other spaces. Gluttony was sure that without the ability to move between spaces, the grimoire would not escape. Looking at his hand, while in his thoughts, Theodore noted that if Gluttony was not lying, then everything would work out perfectly, adding that even a grimoire would not be able to leave this space. Paying attention to the powerful bursts of aura, the main character assumed that his luck was not very good. Looking at the red streams of the raging aura, Theodore reported that space was disappearing faster than he thought. With incredible speed, the bowels of space continued to pull the main character inside. Having completed the absorption process, the space closed together. The stunned guys saw Theodore's body hanging in the air. Running up to him, Sylvia tried to find out if he was okay. Smiling, the main character noted that the cave would soon be completely destroyed, inviting the guys to postpone the touching reunion. After which, the guys rushed outside, trying to save the dungeon from the rubble. Wary, Theodore turned his head. Turning his attention to Randolph, the main character noted that he had finally gotten his hands on the relic. Hearing this, Randolph wondered if he had noticed it. Putting his hand on the magic weapon, he said that he had to work a little for them, saying that it was now a matter of time before he reached the level of a swordmaster. Continuing his escape from the dungeon, Randolph asked if the main character wanted to see this, saying that it would wait for now. Looking at the falling debris, Randolph reported that everything was collapsing, noting that there was still some time left. After which, pitch darkness arose in the dungeon. It was gradually getting dark on the city streets. The reflections of the sun setting into the sunset could be seen in the windows of the building. In the girl's hands one could see the dishes that were intended for the guest. The laughter of visitors could be heard throughout the tavern. Being on the second floor, the main character watched the solemn celebration. Leaning on the wooden fence, in his thoughts, Theodore said that in the end they defeated the Elder Lick, noting that in his opinion he was just lucky and such an accident was unlikely to happen again. With an annoyed expression on his face, he continued to think that he was not strong enough. Turning his head, Theodore heard Randolph call out to him. He, in turn, wondered why the main character was so sad, noting that they had won. Turning around, Theodore said that the contract had already ended, focusing his attention on the fact that Randolph still called him young master. Declaring that everything was simple, Randolph wondered what he would do if Theodore forced him to work overtime to earn the 200 gold he paid. Looking at the grinning Randolph, the protagonist called him heartless, asking rhetorically if he had helped him find the relics. After which, Randolph invited him to look at them. Picking up the relic, he said that since ancient times, people have been crazy about swords. Paying attention to him, Theodore noted that they looked different in the cave. Randolph further asked if the protagonist noticed this, stating that except for the blade itself, all the parts were replaced with new ones, adding that the 200 gold spent was worth it. Looking at Randolph sheathing his blades, the protagonist wondered how much more he wanted. Randolph asked why Theodore should not retrain from a magician to a merchant. Looking at the stunned protagonist, he noted that there was no point in making the lady wait so long. Turning to the taken aback Sylvia, the girl tried to find out when she would marry Theodore. The woman asked if she could be called Madam in advance. The excited protagonist reminded them of the words that everything was wrong. Looking at Randolph, who had turned away, he asked him to stop spreading rumors. Looking at the embarrassed Sylvia, the stranger noted that it sounded great. Turning to Grandpa Albert, Theodore stated that he was embarrassing her, asking him to stop. With a smile on his face, Randolph noted that the main character had become the same. After listening to Albert, Sylvia's face was filled with embarrassment. Randolph greeted the main character, who found himself at home. With his hands in his pockets, Shugel headed up the stairs. In the vastness of the city, conversations of citizens could be heard. Shugel's hand went to the door, after which, he started knocking on it. Suddenly, from a closed room, some sounds were heard. Opening the door, Shugel froze in one position. Horrified, he wondered what was going on here. He didn't expect to receive an invitation from the Red Tower Master, who was the second busiest person after His Majesty. Smiling, Veronica said that she remembered that Shugel did not come, no matter how many times she called him. Closing his eyes, he noted that it wasn't that important right now. Looking at Veronica, who was adjusting the glove on her hand, Shugel wondered why she called him. Folding her hands, she said that they should get down to business, whether he had heard about pacifying the Elder Lick. Smirking, Shugel tried to find out if she was talking about the one that the winner of the student tournament allowed. Averting her gaze, Veronica noted that this was expected, stating that Shugel was as quick as always and asking if he understood what she was getting at. Looking at Veronica, who put her hand on the table, Shugel said that the man already had an appointment. Interrupting him, she asked him to give it to her. Turning around, Shugel said that he would like to help with this, noting that, unfortunately, he would not do it this time. Veronica wondered if he would help by asking who the young man was about to meet. Shugel folded his hands and said that this was confidential information. After which, Veronica again asked to just tell her about it. Raising his finger, he tried to find out whether he should regard this as an order, or simply as an outburst of anger. With her hand to her throat, Veronica stated that it was an order, asking if he would be upset if she said so. Taking the book in his hands, Shugel said that this was not so, noting that it was just a joke, adding that he was just teasing her. Wary, he declared that His Majesty the King was the one who had made the appointment with him, asking if she still wanted to see him. Smiling, Veronica said that it was so. With her hands folded, she told him that she was interested in him. A torch was visible in the guy's hand. Going down the stairs, turning to Johnny, the stranger tried to find out if he was sure that this was the same place. Johnny reported that the detection stone was reacting to something underneath them. Looking around, the stranger noted that in any case, there were curses at every turn, asking if Johnny was sure that the treasure was here. Indignant, calling Johnny a brat, the stranger said that he had to answer when he was asked about something. After which, Johnny asked him to look. Horrified, he reported that the ceiling was collapsing. Before his eyes, in the depths of the dungeon, a hole appeared on the ceiling. Screaming in fear, the guys tried to escape from the scene. Turning his attention to Johnny, who had his eyes closed, the stranger tried to find out if everything was okay with him. In his eyes there was a dim image of some creature. Having opened them completely, Johnny turned his attention to the monster, which let out a terrifying roar. Raising its tentacles, it continued to emit an ominous roar. Putting his hands on the straps of the backpack, turning to Johnny, the stranger wondered if the thing was a treasure. Looking at the enraged monster, Johnny reported that this was not the case, noting that they had been deceived. Suddenly, the monster's paw moved towards his body. The stranger could not understand what Johnny was talking about. In the depths of the dungeon, his silhouette was visible, heading towards the monster with unimaginable speed. Squeezing their bodies in his hands, the monster froze in one position. Many red spikes were visible from its back. Looking at the frightened Johnny, he noted that this was something new, asking if he had come to become his food, calling him a worthless little man. With a face full of horror, Johnny, the unknown creature, began to emit a terrifying roar.